My dad barged into my apartment yelling, "Tell me you didn't eat those cookies I left on the counter." The apartment door exploded inward so violently that the doorknob punched a hole through the drywall. My dad stood there in the doorway with his chest heaving and sweat running down his face like he'd sprinted up all 4 flights of stairs without stopping once. His work boots left muddy tracks on my clean carpet and his hands were shaking so badly I could see them trembling from across the room. "Tell me you didn't eat those cookies I left on the counter." His voice came out as a desperate scream that made my Netflix show pause automatically from the sudden noise. His face had gone completely white except for 2 bright red spots on his cheeks. "What cookies?" I sat up fast and my laptop slid off my legs onto the couch cushions. My stomach did this weird flip because something about his expression made every instinct in my body scream that something was terribly wrong. "The ones in the plastic container? The blue one with the white lid? The oatmeal raisin cookies? Did you eat them?" His eyes were so wide I could see white all around his pupils. "Oh yeah. I had like 5 or 6 of them with my coffee this morning around 10. They were really good." "Where did you get the recipe?" I was already standing up because the panic in his voice was contagious. "They weren't meant for you." Dad pulled out his phone with fingers that wouldn't cooperate and almost dropped it twice before managing to open his contacts. My boyfriend Liam came out of the bathroom with toothpaste foam still on his face, asking what all the yelling was about. Dad ignored him completely and put his phone on speaker. A calm female voice answered, saying this was poison control, and how could she help him today? My knees went weak and I grabbed the back of the couch to keep from falling. "I need to report an accidental ingestion of strychnine. My daughter consumed approximately 5 to 6 cookies containing rat poison intended for pest control. She needs immediate medical attention." The room started spinning and I felt all the blood drain from my face. The poison control operator started firing questions at Dad in rapid succession while I stood there frozen. "How much does she weigh? When exactly did she consume the cookies? Is she showing any symptoms like muscle stiffness, tremors, or difficulty breathing?" Dad answered everything while walking toward me and gripping my shoulders so hard it hurt. 130 pounds. Around 10 this morning. So about 3 hours ago. "I don't know about symptoms yet. She seems okay right now, but I just found out 5 minutes ago when I got home and saw the wrong container was missing." His voice cracked on the last words. "Get her to the nearest emergency room immediately." The operator's voice lost its professional calm for just a second. Strychnine acts very fast on the nervous system. She could start experiencing severe muscle spasms, convulsions, and respiratory failure within 30 minutes to 2 hours of ingestion. Do not let her eat or drink anything else. Keep her calm and drive safely but quickly. I'll stay on the line with you until you reach the hospital." The words hit me like physical blows, and suddenly my legs wouldn't hold me up anymore. Liam caught me before I hit the floor. "This has to be some kind of mistake." My voice came out small and scared like a child's voice. "You wouldn't bake rat poison into cookies. That doesn't make any sense." Dad's face crumpled and he looked older than I'd ever seen him look before. "I did exactly that yesterday afternoon. I mixed commercial-grade strychnine powder into cookie dough and baked 2 dozen cookies to use as bait at my warehouse. We've had a massive rat infestation for 3 weeks, getting into the inventory and contaminating thousands of dollars worth of auto parts. Someone told me this method works better than traps because rats are attracted to the smell of baking." I labeled the container with 3 red skulls drawn in permanent marker and the word poison written in capital letters. Dad's voice kept breaking as he explained. "I left it in my truck overnight, planning to take it to the warehouse first thing this morning, but I must have grabbed the wrong container when I stopped by here at 7 this morning to drop off your mail. I didn't realize my mistake until I got home 30 minutes ago and saw the poison container still sitting in my kitchen right where I left it. That's when I knew I'd brought you the wrong batch and my heart just stopped." Liam was already grabbing my shoes and jacket from the closet. His hands were shaking, but his voice stayed steady and calm. "We need to leave right now. Give me your keys. I can drive faster." He took Dad's truck keys without waiting for permission, and the 3 of us ran toward the door. My stomach cramped hard halfway down the stairs, and I doubled over on the second-floor landing, clutching the railing. The pain felt like someone was twisting my insides with both hands. Dad caught me before I fell and practically carried me the rest of the way down, while the poison control operator kept talking through the phone speaker about symptoms to watch for. In the parking lot, Liam threw open the back door of Dad's pickup truck, and Dad climbed in with me. He pulled me against his chest, and I could feel how hard his heart was pounding through his work shirt. The operator was telling him to monitor my breathing and watch for muscle stiffness or spasms. If I started having seizures before we reached the hospital, they needed to pull over immediately and call 911 instead of trying to drive. My hands started trembling without me controlling them at all. I held them up and watched my fingers shake like I was watching someone else's hands. Dad saw it and his face went even whiter if that was possible. "That's a symptom. We need to hurry." Liam drove like he was in a high-speed chase, weaving through midday traffic and running a light that had just turned red. A horn blared behind us, but he didn't slow down at all. Dad kept checking his watch every 30 seconds and asking me questions to keep me conscious and alert. "Can you feel your toes? Is your jaw tight? Are you having trouble breathing?" The questions came faster than I could answer them. Every muscle in my body felt tense and wrong, like they were all pulling in different directions at once. My jaw started clenching on its own, and I couldn't make it stop, no matter how hard I tried to relax. Dad saw my jaw lock up and told Liam to go faster. The speedometer needle climbed past 70 in a 45 zone. We were maybe 8 minutes from Regional Medical Center when my back suddenly arched without warning and my whole body went completely rigid. I couldn't control anything. Every muscle contracted at once and pain exploded through my spine like lightning. Dad was yelling my name over and over, but his voice sounded far away and distorted. The poison control operator was giving instructions about pulling over safely and calling for an ambulance. Liam swerved into a gas station parking lot and slammed on the brakes. Dad laid me across the back seat and tilted my head to keep my airway open. He was on the phone with 911 now, and I could hear sirens getting closer already. The spasms kept coming in waves. My body would go rigid for 10 or 15 seconds, then relax for maybe 5 seconds before the next one hit. Each spasm felt like my bones would snap from the pressure. I bit my tongue during one of them and tasted blood. The paramedics arrived in less than 2 minutes. They immediately started an IV in my left arm while asking Dad questions about what I'd ingested and how much. One of them listened to my heart and lungs with a stethoscope while another checked my pupils with a small flashlight. They gave me something through the IV that the medic said would help control the muscle spasms and prevent seizures. Within 30 seconds, I felt the medicine hit my system and the rigid feeling in my muscles started to ease just slightly. They loaded me onto a stretcher and into the back of the ambulance in under 60 seconds. The ride to the hospital was a blur of bright lights and loud voices and machines beeping. They gave me activated charcoal through a tube they pushed down my throat. It was the single most horrible thing I'd ever experienced in my life. The thick black liquid felt like drinking sand, and I gagged so hard I thought I'd choke. But the paramedic held my head steady and kept talking in this calm voice, saying the charcoal would bind to the poison in my stomach before my body could absorb more of it. The process took maybe 2 minutes, but felt like an hour. At the emergency room, they wheeled me straight past the waiting area full of sick people and into a trauma bay. A young doctor who looked like she couldn't be older than 30 started shouting orders at 3 nurses. They hooked me up to at least 6 different monitors that beeped and flashed with numbers I didn't understand. The doctor shined a bright light in my eyes and tested my reflexes with a rubber hammer on my knees. She pressed on my abdomen in different spots, asking if it hurt while a nurse wrote down everything on a tablet. Another nurse started a second IV in my right arm. The doctor turned to Dad, who was standing in the corner looking completely destroyed. The next 4 to 6 hours are absolutely critical. Strychnine is a neurotoxin that affects the central nervous system by blocking glycine receptors. There's no specific antidote available. We have to treat the symptoms as they appear and hope we caught this early enough. She already absorbed a significant amount based on the timeline you provided and the symptoms she's showing. The activated charcoal will help, but only if there's still unabsorbed poison in her gastrointestinal tract. Dad's face crumpled, and he started actually crying with real tears running down his face into his beard. This is completely my fault. I should have been more careful. I should have checked the container twice before bringing anything into her apartment. I almost killed my own daughter because I wasn't paying attention. His whole body shook with sobs. Liam put his hand on Dad's shoulder but didn't say anything because what could anyone possibly say that would make this situation better? A different nurse came in with a clipboard asking questions about my medical history. Did I have any allergies to medications? Had I ever had seizures before? Was I taking any prescription drugs or supplements? Dad answered everything while watching the monitors like they held the secret to keeping me alive. The numbers kept jumping around and alarms would go off every few minutes, making everyone rush over to check something. Another nurse started a third IV line and explained they needed multiple access points for all the medications they'd be giving me over the next several hours. After about 45 minutes, a different doctor entered the room. She was older, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses hanging on a chain around her neck. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Reeves and said she specialized in toxicology and poisoning cases. She'd been called in specifically for my case. She asked Dad to walk her through exactly what happened from the very beginning and to include every detail no matter how small it seemed. Don't leave anything out. Dad took a shaky breath and started explaining. I own a small auto parts distribution warehouse on the east side of town near the industrial park. We store brake pads, filters, belts, that kind of inventory for local mechanics and repair shops. About 3 weeks ago, we started noticing rats everywhere. They were chewing through cardboard boxes and contaminating parts with droppings and urine. We were losing inventory and customers were complaining about the smell. I tried traditional snap traps, but the rats were too smart and avoided them. I tried poison bait stations, but they weren't working fast enough. We were hemorrhaging money every single day. My warehouse manager is a guy named Richard Kimball. Dr. Reeves wrote down the name. He told me about this method he'd used successfully at a previous job. You mix strychnine powder into something rats find irresistible, like peanut butter or cookie dough. Bake it so it smells good and the rats can't resist. He said it works way better than commercial bait because rats have evolved to avoid those. He gave me a recipe and even helped me source the strychnine from an agricultural supply company. Said he'd done this exact same thing before with amazing results. Got rid of a whole infestation in 3 days. Dr. Reeves made notes on her tablet without interrupting. So I mixed up a batch yesterday afternoon. I used 2 boxes of oatmeal cookie mix, added the strychnine powder according to Richard's measurements, and baked 2 dozen cookies. They looked and smelled exactly like regular homemade cookies. I put them in a blue plastic container with a white lid. It's the same kind of container I use for regular food. I drew 3 red skulls on the lid with permanent marker and wrote the word poison in huge letters. I left it in my truck overnight because I planned to head straight to the warehouse first thing this morning. But then I got a call at 6:30 this morning from my daughter's landlord. Her building received a bunch of mail that had been misdelivered to my address by mistake. Important stuff like bills and official documents. I told him I'd drop everything off before work since I drive right past her building anyway. I went to my kitchen and grabbed what I thought was a container of regular oatmeal raisin cookies I'd baked for myself 3 days ago. Dad's voice cracked again. I didn't look at the lid carefully. I just grabbed a blue container from my counter and left. I got to her apartment around 7 in the morning. She was still asleep, so I used my spare key to leave the mail and cookies on her counter with a note. Then I drove to work. I didn't realize my horrible mistake until I got home around 11:30 for an early lunch. That's when I saw the container with the poison cookies still sitting on my kitchen counter exactly where I'd left it last night. My heart just stopped. I looked around frantically and the container of regular cookies was gone. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that I'd brought the wrong container to my daughter's apartment. I called her immediately, but she didn't answer because she silences her phone when she's watching movies. I jumped back in my truck and broke every speed limit getting to her place. Dr. Reeves listened to everything without showing any emotion on her face. When Dr. Reeves finished taking notes, she asked if Dad still had the container the poisoned cookies had been in. Dad said it was still in his truck parked in the emergency bay. She immediately sent a security officer to retrieve it as evidence for the investigation. Then she turned back to Dad with a very serious expression. I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. Strychnine is one of the most toxic substances we deal with in emergency medicine. It causes violent muscle contractions by interfering with neurotransmitter function. In severe poisoning cases, the muscle spasms become so intense they can cause bone fractures, rhabdomyolysis where muscle tissue breaks down, and respiratory failure when the diaphragm stops working. Based on your timeline, she consumed approximately 5 or 6 cookies 3 to 4 hours ago. That's a significant and potentially lethal dose. How much strychnine was in each cookie? Dr. Reeves asked. Dad pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of the recipe Richard had given him. She studied it for a long moment and her expression darkened. This is a dangerously high concentration. Whoever gave you these measurements either didn't know what they were doing or deliberately provided incorrect information. This amount per cookie is roughly 10 times what would be used in commercial rodent control products. 1 cookie would be enough to seriously harm an adult. 5 or 6 cookies could absolutely be fatal. The security officer returned with the blue container sealed in a clear evidence bag. Dr. Reeves examined it carefully through the plastic. The red skulls Dad had drawn were clearly visible on the lid. She took photos of it from multiple angles with her phone. Then she asked Dad about his relationship with me, and whether we had any conflicts or financial disputes. Her tone stayed professional, but I could tell she was evaluating whether this might have been intentional rather than accidental. Dad's face flushed red with anger and hurt. We have an excellent relationship. She's my only child. My wife died 4 years ago from cancer, and it's been just the 2 of us since then. We have dinner together twice a week. She calls me for advice about everything. I would never in a million years deliberately hurt her. Check my phone records. Check my bank accounts. There's no insurance policy. No inheritance dispute. This was a horrible accident caused by my carelessness and nothing else. His voice rose with each sentence until he was almost shouting. Dr. Reeves nodded and made a note, but her expression didn't change. A social worker appeared about an hour into my treatment. She had kind brown eyes and spoke in a gentle voice that somehow made everything feel worse instead of better. She explained that any case involving poisoning of any kind required mandatory reporting to law enforcement regardless of intent or circumstances. The police would need to investigate to determine whether this was truly accidental or if there were any criminal negligence issues. She emphasized this was standard protocol and didn't mean anyone was being accused of anything. But I could see Dad's face fall when she said police. 2 officers showed up maybe 30 minutes later. One was younger, probably in his early 30s, with a notebook and pen. The other was older, with gray streaks in his dark hair and a body camera clipped to his uniform. They asked to interview Dad and me separately. The younger officer, whose name tag said Stevens, stayed with me while Dad went with the older officer, whose name was Kowalski, to a private consultation room down the hall. Officer Stevens pulled a chair close to my bed and opened his notebook. I need you to walk me through your entire morning starting from when you woke up. Take your time and include every detail you can remember even if it seems unimportant. His voice was neutral and professional. I told him I'd slept late because it was Saturday and I didn't have class or work. I woke up around 9:30 and made coffee in my little kitchen. I saw the blue container on my counter with a note from Dad saying he'd stopped by to drop off mail and brought me some cookies he'd baked. I ate 6 of them while drinking my coffee and watching Netflix on my laptop. They tasted completely normal. Sweet and cinnamony with oats and raisins. There was nothing unusual about them at all. Officer Stevens wrote everything down carefully. How would you describe your relationship with your father? Do you two get along well, or is there conflict between you? I stared at him, trying to understand why he was asking. We're really close. He's been my main support system since my mom died. We talk almost every day. He helps me with rent sometimes when I'm short. He comes to all my important events. We don't fight about anything. The officer made more notes. Has your father seemed stressed lately? Any financial problems that you know about? Has he mentioned anything about his business struggling? I thought about it carefully. He mentioned the rat problem at his warehouse last week when we had dinner. Said it was costing him money because he had to throw out contaminated inventory. But he didn't seem desperate or anything. Just annoyed and trying to figure out how to solve the problem. He's owned that warehouse for 15 years and it does fine. Not making him rich, but covering his bills and his mortgage. Officer Stevens wrote everything down, then asked if Dad had any life insurance policies on me. My stomach twisted. There's an old policy from when I was a kid. Like $50,000 maybe? He's listed as the beneficiary. But it's just one of those things parents do. It's not like he ever talks about it or anything. The officer asked more questions about Dad's behavior over the past few months. Had he been acting strange or out of character? Had he given away any possessions or made comments about wanting to die or wanting me to die? The questions made me feel sick. No, nothing like that at all. He's been completely normal. Maybe a little tired from dealing with the warehouse problems, but otherwise normal. Officer Stevens closed his notebook and thanked me for cooperating. He said they'd be in touch if they had follow-up questions. When Dad came back into the room about 45 minutes later, his eyes were red and swollen. He looked like he'd aged 10 years during the interview. He collapsed into the chair beside my bed without saying anything for a long time. Finally, he spoke in this hollow voice. They think I did this on purpose. They asked me about money problems and your insurance policy and whether we'd been arguing. They wanted to know if I had any history of mental illness or violent behavior. They asked about my relationship with your mother and if her death had made me depressed or suicidal. They treated me like a criminal who tried to murder his own daughter. Officer Kowalski returned about an hour later to tell us they'd be investigating thoroughly, but for now Dad was free to stay. He asked Dad not to leave town and to make himself available for follow-up questioning. He also took Dad's phone and said they'd need to keep it for a few days to examine calls, texts, and search history. Dad handed it over without arguing, even though I could see how much it upset him. After the officers left, Dad sat with his face in his hands. The warehouse is losing money. I didn't want to worry you, but it's been bad for about 6 months. I took out a business loan to cover payroll and rent. I missed the last 3 payments because I had to choose between the loan and keeping the lights on. It looks really bad for me. I wanted to say something comforting, but another spasm hit, and my back arched off the bed. The monitors started alarming, and nurses rushed in to give me more medication. When the spasm finally released, I felt completely exhausted. Dr. Reeves returned to examine me and adjust my medication dosages. She explained they were trying to find the right balance to control my symptoms, without oversedating me to the point where they couldn't monitor my neurological status. Every hour mattered right now. The poison was at peak concentration in my system, and the next 8 to 12 hours would determine if I had any permanent damage. Night fell, and I drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time I woke up, Dad was sitting in the same chair watching me. Liam had gone home around 8 to feed our cat and grab some supplies, but promised to come back first thing in the morning. The hospital room felt cold and sterile. Machines beeped constantly. Nurses came in every 15 minutes to check my vitals and ask me questions. Can you squeeze my hand? Can you wiggle your toes? Follow my finger with your eyes? The questions never stopped. Around midnight, my lawyer arrived. Dad had called him earlier in the evening. His name was Jeffrey Paulson, and he'd handled Dad's business contracts for years. He was a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit despite the late hour. He spoke with Dad in hushed tones in the corner while I pretended to sleep. I heard him say they needed to be proactive about the investigation. He'd already contacted a forensic accountant to go through Dad's financial records and document that Dad had been trying to save his business through legitimate means. He'd also found documentation showing Dad had actually reduced my life insurance policy 6 months ago to save money on premiums. Jeffrey spent an hour asking Dad detailed questions about the cookies. Who else knew about them? Where did the recipe come from? Could anyone else have accessed them? Dad explained about his warehouse manager Richard giving him the recipe and helping source the strychnine. Jeffrey made extensive notes and said he'd want to interview Richard as soon as possible. Something about the recipe concentrations bothered him. He said it didn't make sense for rodent control and he wanted an expert to examine it. By Sunday morning, my symptoms had improved enough that they moved me from the trauma bay to the intensive care unit. Dr. Reeves said this was good progress. My body was processing the poison and responding to treatment, but she warned that recovery would take weeks or possibly months. I'd likely have lingering effects including muscle weakness, nerve pain, and possible kidney damage from the rhabdomyolysis. They were monitoring my creatine kinase levels to check for muscle breakdown products. The numbers were elevated but not critically high yet. Jeffrey returned Sunday afternoon with a woman he introduced as Sylvia Wright, a forensic toxicologist. She'd reviewed photos of the cookie recipe and brought printouts of her analysis. She sat down with Dad and me and explained that the strychnine concentration in the recipe was completely inappropriate for rodent control. Commercial rodenticides typically contain 0.5% to 1% strychnine by weight. This recipe called for concentrations closer to 8 to 10%. At that level, even small amounts would be rapidly fatal to rats. They'd likely die after one bite, and other rats would learn to avoid the bait. The recipe made no sense from a pest control perspective, but made perfect sense if someone wanted to poison a human. Dad's face went white. Are you saying Richard deliberately gave me a recipe that would kill someone? Sylvia pulled out more documents. I did some research on Richard Kimball. He has a history of working in pest control but was fired from his last 3 jobs. One firing was for gross negligence after he accidentally poisoned a client's dog. Another was for violating safety protocols. The 3rd firing involved allegations he'd threatened a coworker. I found no evidence he'd ever successfully used poisoned bait cookies at any job. That entire story appears to be fabricated. Jeffrey leaned forward. Did Richard have any reason to want to harm you or your daughter? Dad thought about it carefully. Richard applied for a promotion to assistant manager about 6 months ago. I turned him down because of performance issues. He'd been showing up late and making mistakes on inventory orders. He was angry about it. Said I was discriminating against him because he didn't go to college. We had a pretty big argument and I put him on a performance improvement plan. He's been hostile ever since, but I never thought he'd do something like this. Sylvia continued. I think Richard deliberately provided you with a deadly recipe knowing you'd use it. He may have been hoping you'd accidentally poison yourself while handling it, or that rats would die immediately and alert you something was wrong. But when you decided to bake them into cookies, he saw an opportunity for something worse. Did he know you have a daughter? Dad nodded slowly. He's met her twice when she stopped by the warehouse. He knows I'm close with her. Oh God, this is so much worse than I thought. Jeffrey immediately called the police detective handling the case. He explained Sylvia's findings and Richard's background. He insisted they needed to interview Richard immediately and examine his communications with Dad. The detective agreed to bring Richard in for questioning Monday morning. Jeffrey also said he'd be providing the police with all of Sylvia's documentation and expert analysis. This changed everything. If Richard had deliberately set Dad up, this wasn't negligent poisoning. This was attempted murder. Monday morning, 2 detectives went to the warehouse to question Richard. Dad's assistant manager called to say Richard hadn't shown up for his shift, which was completely unusual for him, despite his other problems. They tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. They sent a patrol car to his apartment and found it completely cleaned out. Richard had disappeared. The investigation expanded immediately. Police obtained warrants for Richard's phone records, bank accounts, and employment history. They discovered he'd purchased a one-way bus ticket to Phoenix, leaving Sunday evening. Police in Arizona were notified and started looking for him. Meanwhile, forensic accountants found that Richard had been stealing from the warehouse for at least 8 months. He'd been creating fake vendor invoices and pocketing the payments. Dad's financial problems weren't just from the rats. Richard had been actively embezzling. Dr. Reeves came in Monday afternoon with updated test results. My creatine kinase levels had peaked but were starting to come down. My kidney function looked stable. The muscle spasms had decreased significantly, and I'd gone 6 hours without a major episode. She said I'd turned a corner, and barring any complications, I should make a full recovery. It would take time and physical therapy, but I'd be okay. The relief on Dad's face was overwhelming. Jeffrey called Tuesday morning with news. Police in Phoenix had located Richard attempting to board another bus to Los Angeles. He was arrested and was being extradited back to face charges, including attempted murder, embezzlement, and providing false information with intent to cause harm. Dad's theory was that Richard wanted Dad to accidentally poison himself to prevent Dad from discovering the embezzlement and reporting it. When Dad survived and brought cookies to me instead, Richard saw it as an acceptable outcome. He'd eliminate the daughter of the man who'd denied him a promotion. The detectives came back to interview Dad and me with completely different attitudes. They apologized for the earlier suspicion and explained they'd had to investigate all possibilities. Now they understood Dad was a victim too. The charges against Richard were severe and he was looking at decades in prison. They'd recovered text messages between Richard and someone else discussing getting rid of Dad. The investigation was still ongoing, but they had enough evidence to proceed. Wednesday morning, they moved me from the ICU to a regular hospital room. I could walk short distances with help. The tremors had mostly stopped. I still felt weak and tired, but so much better than 3 days ago. Dad stayed with me constantly, except when nurses made him leave for procedures. Liam brought food and clean clothes. Friends sent flowers and cards. The room started feeling less like a hospital and more like a recovery space. Thursday, Jeffrey met with Dad to discuss civil litigation against Richard and potentially the agricultural supply company that sold strychnine without proper documentation. Dad wasn't sure he wanted to pursue it. He just wanted to close the warehouse and move on. But Jeffrey insisted the civil case could recover the embezzled money plus damages for emotional distress and medical costs. The medical bills were already over $300,000 and rising. Friday morning, a week after I'd eaten the poisoned cookies, Dr. Reeves discharged me with strict instructions. I needed to rest for at least 2 weeks. No work, no classes, no strenuous activity. I had prescriptions for muscle relaxers and pain medication. Physical therapy would start in 2 weeks. I had follow-up appointments with nephrology to monitor my kidneys and neurology to check for nerve damage. She gave me a thick packet of information about strychnine poisoning recovery and what symptoms should send me back to the emergency room immediately. Dad helped me into his truck and drove me to his house instead of my apartment. He said I'd be staying with him until I was strong enough to live alone again. The first few days home were difficult. I was exhausted doing simple things like walking to the bathroom or getting dressed. The medications made me nauseous. But slowly, I started feeling more like myself. Dad cooked all my favorite meals and we watched movies together. We talked about Mom and how much we both missed her. We talked about Richard and how betrayed Dad felt. 2 weeks later, Dad officially closed the warehouse. He told his remaining employees they'd be let go, but helped them file for unemployment. He contacted his landlord about breaking the lease early. He started bankruptcy proceedings to discharge the business debts and medical bills. It was painful watching him lose the business he'd built over 15 years, but he said it was worth it if it meant I was alive and safe. Richard's trial was scheduled for 6 months later. The prosecutor was confident about a conviction given the evidence. Richard had been denied bail and was sitting in county jail. The detectives had uncovered even more evidence of his crimes, including previous attempts to harm Dad by tampering with equipment at the warehouse. It was a miracle Dad hadn't been seriously hurt before the cookie incident. 3 months after the poisoning, I returned to classes part-time. I still had muscle weakness and occasional tremors. Nerve pain in my hands and feet came and went without warning, but I was alive and recovering. Physical therapy helped rebuild my strength. I learned to pace myself and rest when I needed to. Dad got a job as a night manager at a large grocery store chain. The pay was a fraction of what he'd made from the warehouse, but it was steady income with benefits. He seemed lighter somehow without the stress of the failing business and Richard's sabotage. 6 months later, Richard pled guilty to attempted murder and embezzlement in exchange for a 25-year sentence without possibility of parole for 15 years. The judge called his crimes particularly heinous because he deliberately endangered an innocent person to cover his own theft. Dad and I attended the sentencing. I gave a victim impact statement describing the physical and emotional toll of the poisoning. The courtroom was silent while I spoke about muscle spasms and kidney damage and nightmares about dying. The civil case settled 8 months after the poisoning. Richard had no assets, but his elderly parents owned a small farm. They sold it and gave us the proceeds as restitution, about $150,000. The agricultural supply company settled for another $200,000 after Jeffrey proved they'd sold strychnine to Dad without requiring proper licensing or documentation. After lawyer fees and medical bills, Dad and I split roughly $200,000. It wasn't enough to erase what happened, but it was something. 1 year after eating those cookies, I was mostly recovered. Occasional muscle spasms still happened maybe once a month. The nerve pain had improved, but probably would never completely go away. I'd finished physical therapy and was back to full-time classes. Dad had been promoted to assistant store manager and was dating a woman named Caroline who worked in the bakery. We still had dinner every Sunday and never talked about Richard or the warehouse or the poisoning unless one of us brought it up first. We'd both learned life was too precious to waste on anger or what-ifs. We'd survived something that should have killed me, and that was enough.